Some stories arrive when we least expect them. This one came to me through a friend of a friend. Passed along the way, good stories used to travel by word of mouth. From one kitchen table to another, I cannot swear that every detail happened exactly as told. But I believe the heart of it is true. This is a story about a dog who never stopped hoping, a man who had forgotten how, and an old girl who had given up on everything except love. If you have ever carried something heavy in your chest that you couldn't explain to anyone, if you have ever wondered whether kindness still exists in this hard world, then maybe this story found its way to you for a reason. Pull up a chair, stay a while, and let me tell you what happened at Hollow Creek. The couple walked slowly down the concrete aisle, their footsteps echoing against the metal cages. The smell hit them, first wet fur, cheap disinfectant. Something older and sadder underneath. Margaret Hollis held her husband's arm, 63 years old. Retired schoolteacher, searching for a companion now that the house had grown too quiet. Walter suggested it over breakfast that morning. A dog might do us good, he said. She wasn't certain. But here they were. The shelter manager led them past cage after cage, an old man with calloused hands and a permanent stoop in his spine. "Most of these fellas been here a while," he said. "Folks want puppies, don't want the ones with history." Margaret nodded. She understood. History was heavy. History left marks. They turned into the last row. Darker here. The overhead bulb flickered and buzzed like a dying insect. Fewer barks. The dogs in this section had stopped trying. Then Walter stopped walking. "Maggie?" His voice came out strange, thin. "Look at this." She stepped beside him and looked into the cage. A German Shepherd young, maybe a year old. Ribs showing through dull gray fur, was kneeling, not lying down, not sitting, kneeling. His front legs were folded beneath his chest, head bowed low, muzzle nearly touching the cold concrete floor. His eyes were closed. Margaret's breath caught. She had seen dogs sit, seen dogs beg. But this looked like something else entirely. "What in the world?" Walter whispered. The shelter manager came up behind them. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the dog with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe, or something closer to wonder. "He does that," the old man finally said. "Every time someone comes through, every single time." "Does what exactly?" "Kneels, right there, in front of that cage." Margaret looked past the kneeling dog to the cage beside it. Another German Shepherd lay inside, older, much older. The fur around her muzzle nearly white. She wasn't moving, wasn't lifting her head. But her eyes were open, fixed on the young dog with an intensity that made Margaret's chest tighten. "Is that his mother?" she asked. The manager shook his head. "No, ma'am. Not by blood, anyway. He came in about 2 months ago, beaten half to death. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink. Just shook in the corner like he was waiting to die. Then they brought her in the old girl, found her lying next to her owner's body. Lady passed in her sleep, 3 days before anyone noticed." He paused, rubbed his jaw with a weathered hand. "They put her in the cage next to him, and something changed. He stopped shaking, started eating again, and then he started doing that." Margaret looked back at the young dog, still kneeling, still bowed, like a man in church. "Every time someone walks by," the manager continued, "he does this, like he's asking them for something, not for himself, though for her." Walter's hand found Margaret's. She squeezed without thinking. The old dog in the cage, the one being prayed for, turned her head slightly. Her eyes met Margaret's. There was nothing there anymore. No hope, no expectation. Just a tired acceptance of whatever came next. But the young one kept kneeling, kept believing. "Lord, have mercy," Margaret whispered. The words escaped before she could catch them. "That dog is praying for her." The manager nodded slowly. "That's what folks been saying. Can't explain it myself. I asked the vet. She couldn't explain it either. 40 years doing this work, and I ain't never seen anything like it." They stood there a long moment. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a dog whimpered once and fell silent. Walter cleared his throat. "We should probably look at the other dogs." Margaret didn't move. She couldn't take her eyes off the young shepherd, still frozen in his desperate vigil, still waiting for someone to answer. "Yes," she finally said. "Yes, let's keep looking." They walked away. Past more cages, past more dogs. The manager showed them a friendly Labrador mix, a calm beagle, a gentle mutt with floppy ears and kind eyes. They drove home an hour later without a dog. That night, lying in bed, Margaret stared at the ceiling. Walter's breathing had evened out beside her, but she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing it. The bowed head, the folded paws, the closed eyes, a dog, praying, and no one answering. If this story has found you today, I would be honored to know where you are reading from. Sometimes it helps to remember we are not alone in kindness. Like any good thing, travels farther when shared. Hollow Creek Animal Shelter sat at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen fresh gravel in years. 7 miles outside Millbrook, West Virginia, past the abandoned coal tipple and the rusted water tower with faded letters no one could read anymore. The building itself was nothing much. Cinder block walls, corrugated tin roof streaked orange with rust. A ceiling fan that wobbled and clicked with every rotation, pushing around air that never quite lost the smell of wet dog and bleach. Frank Dawson had run the place alone for 11 years. 68 years old. Former coal miner until the company shut down the shaft in 2009. Bad back, worse knees, hands that shook when he poured his morning coffee but steadied the moment he touched a frightened animal. He took the dogs nobody wanted, the old ones, the sick ones, the ones so scared of people they couldn't stop shaking long enough to eat. The county gave him nothing. Donations came in slow, a bag of kibble here, $20 there. The electric bill sat on his desk, 3 months overdue. The paper soft from how many times he'd folded and unfolded it, 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then he'd have to close the gates for good. The young shepherd came in on a Tuesday. Animal control found him in a trailer park outside town, the one behind the old sawmill where trouble always seemed to find a home. The dog had been used as bait. Training fodder for fighting rings. Bite marks covered his legs and chest. His ribs pressed against his skin like fingers trying to push through. Frank named him Rex. The dog wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, just lay in the corner of his cage and trembled. The old girl arrived 4 days later. Grace. She'd belonged to Dorothy Whitmore, a widow who lived alone up on Miller's Ridge. Dorothy passed in her sleep one night. Nobody found her for 3 days. Grace never left the body. Not once. Frank put her in the cage next to Rex. Figured the old girl might calm the young one down. Give him something to focus on besides his own fear. It worked, but not in any way Frank expected. 42 miles south, in a cabin his father built with borrowed lumber and stubborn hands. Mark Thompson sat on the edge of his bed and watched the darkness outside his window. 3 in the morning. The nightmares had come again. He could still smell the smoke. The bell above the door jingled as Mark pushed into Ellie's diner. Same sound it had made for 30 years. Same smell too, bacon grease, coffee burnt just right, and the faint sweetness of pie cooling somewhere behind the counter. He took his usual booth, corner seat, back to the wall, eyes on the door. Eleanor Henderson appeared with the coffee pot before he'd settled in. 71 years old. Hair pulled back in a silver bun. Apron faded from 1,000 washings. She poured without asking. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said. Mark wrapped his hands around the mug. The heat seeped into his palms. "I'm fine." "Uh-huh." Ellie wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "You know, there's something going on over at Frank Dawson's place. That shelter of his out on Creek Road." Mark lifted the coffee. Didn't drink. "People been talking about it all week. There's this dog out there, young shepherd. Skinny as a rail. Every time someone walks by his cage, he kneels down, folds his front paws under him, bows his head low, just like the old ladies at Sunday service." The mug stopped halfway to his mouth. He does it in front of the cage next to him. There's an old girl in there, barely hanging on. Folks are saying he's praying for her. "Mark? A dog? Praying for another dog?" Ellie's voice softened. She set down the rag. "Well, I thought you might want to know. That's all." She moved away to refill another customer's cup. Mark sat motionless. The coffee grew cold in his hands. The Ford's engine rattled as Mark turned onto the dirt road. Red dust kicked up behind the tires, coating the truck bed in a fine layer of grit. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their shadows striping the windshield. He didn't know why he was here. Told himself he just wanted to see. Once. Then he'd go home and forget about it. The shelter appeared around the last bend, squat and weathered. Tin roof catching the afternoon light. A man stood by the fence, hands working a roll of wire. He looked up as Mark parked. Frank Dawson. Mark recognized the posture before the face, the way he held himself despite the stoop, the steady eyes that had seen things. "You served." Frank said it flat, not a question. "2 tours. My boy, 1 tour. Fallujah." Frank's jaw tightened. "Didn't come back." Neither man spoke. The wind stirred the pine needles. Somewhere inside the building, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Frank nodded toward the door. "You're here about the dog." "Ellie told me. She tells everybody." A ghost of something crossed the old man's face. "Come on, then." The smell hit Mark first. Wet fur. Disinfectant that couldn't quite mask what lay beneath. His boots echoed on the concrete floor as he followed Frank down the center aisle. Dogs watched from both sides. Some pressed against the bars. Others stayed back. Eyes tracking his movement. The barking faded as he walked deeper, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than sound. Last row. Frank stopped. Mark looked into the cage. The shepherd was young, barely more than a pup, maybe 14 months, ribs visible through matted gray fur, scars on his legs and chest, still pink against darker skin. He was kneeling, front legs folded beneath him, head bowed until his muzzle nearly touched the concrete, eyes closed. Mark's chest tightened. His hand found the chain link and gripped hard. In the cage beside the young dog, an older shepherd lay motionless on a thin blanket. Her muzzle had gone white with age. She didn't lift her head, didn't move at all. But her eyes were fixed on the young one with something Mark couldn't name. The image split, doubled. He saw it then Danny kneeling in the sand, hands red and shaking, pressing against Sargent's chest, the smoke, the ringing in his ears. Danny's voice cracking, "Breathe. Come on, boy. Breathe." Mark's grip on the chain link went white-knuckled. "He does that every time," Frank said quietly. "Every single time someone walks by. Been 2 months now." The young dog didn't move. Didn't open his eyes. just kept kneeling there in his silent vigil, not praying. Mark thought the word felt wrong. Begging. He turned and walked away, fast, his boots loud on the concrete, past the other cages, past Frank's voice calling something after him, out the door, into the light. He sat in the truck for a long time, hands on the steering wheel. Engine off. The image wouldn't leave. Folded paws, bowed head, closed eyes, and behind it, always behind it, Danny's face in the dust. Mark turned the key. The engine coughed to life. He drove home. But he already knew. He would go back. The cabin sat dark, except for the single lamp beside the bed. Mark lay on top of the covers, still dressed, boots still on. The ceiling above him held nothing but shadows. 2 a.m, 3. The red numbers on the clock radio blinked forward. He closed his eyes. The image came immediately. Folded paws, bowed head, the young dog kneeling on cold concrete, his eyes opened. He stared at the ceiling again. The photograph on the wall caught the lamplight, him and Danny, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like fools in the Afghan sun. Sergeant sat at their feet, tongue out, ears forward. 2 weeks after that photo, Sergeant pushed Danny out of the Humvee. The IED detonated 3 seconds later. The dog took the blast. Danny knelt in the sand, hands pressing against Sergeant's chest, blood soaking through his fingers. "Breathe," he kept saying. "Come on, boy. Breathe." The dog died in his arms. 2 weeks after that, Danny threw himself over Mark when the second IED went off. Shrapnel tore through his back. He bled out before the medevac arrived. Mark sat up. Sweat had soaked through his shirt. His hand shook as he reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. It sloshed over the rim, wet his fingers, dripped onto the floor. He set the glass down, wiped his hand on his jeans. The photograph watched him from the wall. 5 a.m. The sky outside the window had begun to lighten, a thin gray line along the ridge. Mark stood by the kitchen counter, coffee in a chipped mug. He hadn't tasted it. His eyes drifted to the cabinet above the stove. The bottle of whiskey sat behind the coffee filters where he'd shoved it 2 years ago. Still there, waiting. He looked away. His keys hung on the hook by the door. He picked them up. The Ford pulled up to the shelter gate at 6:45. The sun hadn't cleared the pines yet. Dew clung to the grass. Fog drifted low across the field. Catching the first pale light, Mark cut the engine and sat. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel. Once, twice. The shelter door opened. Frank stepped out, coffee mug in hand, and looked at the truck. He didn't seem surprised. "Figured you might come back." He walked to the gate and unlatched it. Coffee? Sure. Inside, the shelter held the same smell, wet fur, bleach, the undertone of something sadder. Mark's boots echoed on the concrete. The dogs stirred in their cages, watching him pass. Last row, last cage. Rex wasn't kneeling this time. He was pressed into the far corner, body low, ears flat against his skull. His eyes fixed on Mark. His whole body trembled. Mark lowered himself to the concrete floor. 6 feet from the cage, he crossed his legs, rested his hands on his knees, didn't move, didn't speak. 1 hour. Rex's trembling continued, his ribs expanding and contracting with quick, shallow breaths. His eyes never left Mark's face. 2 hours. The trembling slowed. Rex's breathing evened out. He stayed pressed against the back of the cage, but something in his posture shifted, less coiled, less ready to bolt. 3 hours. Rex blinked. Once. Slow. His ears twitched forward, then flattened again. Mark's back ached. His legs had gone numb 20 minutes ago. He didn't move. Frank appeared with a second cup of coffee, set it on the floor beside Mark. "You planning to sit here all day, if I need to? You know he won't trust you in one day." "I know." Frank looked at Mark, looked at Rex. The old man's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. "Well then," he turned and walked back toward the front. "I guess we'll see." Late afternoon. The light through the high windows had gone golden, then orange. Mark's shadow stretched long across the concrete. Rex had moved. Not much, 3 inches, maybe 4. But he was no longer pressed against the back wall. Frank came back as Mark stood, his knees cracking, pins and needles shooting through his feet. "You want to know about him?" Frank leaned against the doorframe. "About what happened?" Mark waited. "They found him in that trailer park out past the sawmill, the one where those boys used to run dogs." Frank's voice flattened. "They used him as bait, threw him in with pit bulls to get them riled up. He's got scars all over, bite marks. Mostly, a couple of them look like cigarette burns." Mark's hands curled into fists at his sides. He said nothing. "Here's the thing, though," Frank's eyes moved to Rex, "he never bit back. Not once. Not ever. The vet figures he must have known people before good people. When he was real small, before they sold him off, part of him still remembers, still believes not everyone wants to hurt him." Rex lay with his head on his paws now. His eyes had closed. His breathing was slow and even. "That's the first time he's slept when someone's been standing there," Frank said quietly. "First time in 2 months. Mark looked at the sleeping dog, at the scars visible through the thin fur, at the way his paws twitched with whatever dream had found him. "What about the old girl?" Mark asked. His voice came out rough. "The one he kneels for?" Frank's expression changed. Something heavier settled into the lines of his face. "That's a different story." He pushed off from the doorframe. "Sadder 1, 2. You sure you want to hear it?" Day 3. Mark arrived at 7 in the morning. Same spot, same position. 6 feet from Rex's cage. Legs crossed, hands on knees. Rex no longer trembled when he saw Mark coming. He still pressed himself against the back corner, still watched with those wary eyes, but the shaking had stopped. Small victories. The town had started talking. Ellie mentioned it when Mark stopped for coffee on day 4, whispers spreading through Millbrook like smoke through screen doors. "People are saying you've lost your mind," she said, filling his mug. Sitting in that shelter all day, staring at a dog. Mark wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic. "Let them talk." "Oh, they will." Ellie set down the pot. "They always do." Day 5. Rex stood up when Mark entered, not cowering anymore, standing. His ears stayed flat, his body tense, but he was on his feet. Grace, in the cage beside him, had begun to watch too. She still wouldn't lift her head from the thin blanket, but her eyes tracked Mark's movements now, following him when he walked past, holding on him when he sat. Frank had told him the story by then, how he'd put Rex in the cage next to Grace on purpose, figured the old girl's calm presence might settle the terrified young dog. It took 3 days before Rex stopped flinching every time Grace shifted on her blanket. Another 2 before he moved to the side of his cage closest to hers. Then the kneeling started, and Frank stopped trying to explain it. Day 6. Mark brought a piece of boiled chicken wrapped in wax paper. He unwrapped it slowly, letting the smell drift through the wire mesh. Then he placed it in his open palm and held his hand outside the cage bars. Rex's nostrils flared. His head turned toward the smell. 1 step forward. Then he froze. Mark didn't move, didn't breathe loudly, just held the chicken and waited. 20 minutes. Rex inched closer. His neck stretched long, nose twitching. 30 minutes. He retreated 2 steps, 45 minutes. He came forward again, closer this time, close enough that Mark could see the scars on his muzzle, the places where fur hadn't grown back right. 1 hour. Rex's mouth opened. His teeth closed around the chicken so gentle Mark barely felt them brush his skin. The dog pulled back immediately, retreating to his corner to eat. Mark's hand stayed where it was, empty now, palm up. Waiting. Rex finished the chicken, licked his lips, looked at the empty hand. Then he lay down. Not in the corner, in the middle of the cage, closer. Word spread faster than Frank expected. By day 7, people had started showing up at the shelter not to adopt, just to see. The praying dog. That's what they called him now. Frank turned most of them away. "This ain't a circus," he told one group of teenagers who'd driven out from town. "Go on home." But some people came with different intentions. A woman dropped off 3 bags of dog food. Wouldn't leave her name. A man in coveralls left an envelope with $40 cash tucked inside. Another woman brought a casserole for Frank. Said she'd heard he was doing the Lord's work out here. Frank ate the casserole. It wasn't bad. Pastor Harold Bennett arrived on day 8. 74 years old. White hair thin across his spotted scalp. Driving a Buick that had seen better decades. He didn't ask to see the praying dog. He asked to see Mark. Frank pointed toward the back. "Last row. He's been there since sunrise." Harold walked slowly. His knees not what they used to be. He found Mark sitting in his usual spot, Rex lying in the center of his cage, both of them still as stones. The pastor lowered himself onto an overturned bucket nearby. His joints popped. He grimaced. "Eleanor tells me you've been here every day." Mark didn't look away from Rex. "That's right. She's worried about you. She worries about everyone." Harold watched the young dog. Rex's ears had perked slightly at the new voice, but he hadn't retreated. "Progress." "You know," Harold said, "the Lord doesn't take attendance. Never has. He just pays attention when someone does right by one of his creatures." Mark said nothing. Harold pushed himself up from the bucket, bones creaking. He looked at Rex, then at Grace in the neighboring cage, then back at Mark. "I reckon they're helping each other," Frank had told him on the phone. Looking at them now, the man who wouldn't leave and the dog who'd stopped running, Harold understood what he meant. "I'll be praying for you," he said. "All 3 of you." He left the way he came. Mark never turned around. Day 12. Frank stood beside Mark with a key in his hand. "You sure about this?" Mark nodded. The lock clicked. The cage door swung open. Rex scrambled backward, pressing himself against the far bars. His eyes went wide. His body dropped low. Mark sat down. Same spot as always, 6 feet away, but now there was nothing between them. No wire, no bars, just air. Rex stared at the open door, at the space beyond it, at Mark. 30 minutes. One paw crossed the threshold. Rex froze. Every muscle locked. 45 minutes. A second paw. He stood half in, half out, caught between the safety of the cage and whatever waited outside. 1 hour. Rex stepped fully out of the cage. His legs shook, his tail tucked tight against his belly, but he was out, standing on open concrete for the first time in months. Mark didn't move, didn't reach, barely breathed. Rex took 1 step toward him, then another. His claws clicked softly on the floor. His nose worked the air, reading scents Mark couldn't imagine. 3 feet away. 2 feet. 1. Rex sat down, right beside Mark, not touching, but there. Present, choosing to be close, behind them. A sound. Mark turned his head slowly. careful not to startle Rex. Grace was standing. Her legs trembled with the effort. Her head hung low, but she was on her feet for the first time in weeks, watching Rex through the bars. Her tail moved. Once, a single, weak wag. Frank's voice came from somewhere near the front, thick and rough. "Well, I'll be—" The county notice arrived 3 days later. Frank had known it was coming. The letters had been piling up for weeks. Warnings about licensing and inspections and funding that didn't exist. 2 weeks, he told Mark that evening. They sat on folding chairs outside the shelter, watching the sun drop behind the pines. After that, "I have to shut down. The dogs go to the county facility." Mark knew what that meant. The county shelter was overcrowded, underfunded, dogs like Grace old, sick, broken, didn't last long there. How much would it take to keep this place open? Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "More than I've got. More than anyone around here's got." Mark looked back toward the shelter. Through the doorway, he could see the last row of cages, Rex lying with his head on his paws. Grace beside him, eyes closed. What if someone adopted them? Both of them. That old girl might not have long left. Her kidneys are giving out. The vet said weeks. Maybe. A month if she's lucky. I know. And Rex, he's better than he was. But he might never be right. Some dogs don't come back all the way from what he went through. I know. Frank turned to look at Mark. Really look at him. The way he'd looked at 100 broken creatures over the years. "Why do you want to do this?" Mark was quiet for a long moment. The crickets had started up in the grass. Somewhere down the road, a truck shifted gears. "Because I know what it's like," he finally said. "To be the one everyone gives up on." Frank held his gaze. Then he nodded slowly and reached into his shirt pocket. "I'll get the paperwork." Mark stood. His legs had gone stiff from sitting. "The adoption fee. And something to help keep this place running a while longer. I've got about $3,000 saved. It's not much, but that'll cover the dogs and maybe 2 months of feed." Frank rubbed his jaw. "Still leaves the electric and the repairs." The next morning, Ellie showed up with a coffee can. Inside was $600 in small bills donations from the diner regulars. Pastor Harold followed with a check from the church's discretionary fund. 400 more. Tucker arrived that afternoon with lumber in his truck bed and no explanation except, "Heard you needed a fence." By week's end, the total had climbed past 5,000. Not enough to save the shelter forever, but enough to keep it breathing. Mark walked back into the shelter that evening, past the rows of cages, to the last row where Rex waited. The dog lifted his head. His ears came forward, and for the first time since Mark had known him, Rex's tail moved a small, uncertain wag. Behind him, Grace had turned to watch. Her eyes held something they hadn't held in months. Mark crouched down beside Rex's cage. The dog didn't flinch, didn't retreat. "We're going home," Mark said quietly. "All of us." But even as he said it, a weight settled in his chest. He knew how to sit with broken things. He didn't know if he could keep them alive. The Ford rolled slow down the dirt road, tires crunching over gravel and fallen pine needles. Mark kept both hands on the wheel, eyes on the ruts ahead. The windows were cracked halfway, letting in air that smelled of earth and resin and something cleaner than anything inside that shelter. Rex sat in the back seat, not lying down, sitting upright, nose working the wind that streamed through the gap. His ears swiveled forward, then back, tracking sounds Mark couldn't hear, every few seconds. He turned to look at the blanket-wrapped shape beside him. Grace lay still, too weak to sit. Her breathing came shallow and slow, her ribs barely rising beneath the old wool blanket Frank had pressed into Mark's hands that morning. But her eyes were open, watching Rex, and her tail gave a small twitch each time he looked her way. The cabin appeared through the trees. Mark pulled up beside the porch and cut the engine. The sudden silence pressed in just wind in the pines, a jay calling somewhere distant, the tick of the cooling engine. He opened the back door. Rex didn't move. The dog stared at the ground outside, at the grass and dirt and open space, and stayed frozen on the seat. Mark stepped back, lowered himself onto the porch steps, waited. 10 minutes. Rex's nose kept working. His paws shifted on the seat leather. 15 minutes. One paw touched the running board, pulled back. 20 minutes. Rex jumped down. His legs locked the moment all four hit the ground. He stood rigid, head low, eyes scanning everything: the cabin, the trees, the shadows between them. His claws dug into the soft earth, then his nose dropped. He sniffed the dirt, the grass, a fallen pine cone. His tail uncurled from his belly just slightly. Mark rose slowly and moved to the other side of the truck. Grace watched him approach. She didn't try to stand, didn't lift her head, just watched with those tired eyes. He slid his arms beneath her. She weighed almost nothing, bones and loose skin and matted fur. Her head lolled against his chest as he lifted her out. Inside, the cabin held the smell of cold wood and dust. Mark carried Grace to the spot beside the fireplace and laid her on the old mattress he'd dragged down from the bedroom that morning. She sank into it with a small exhale, her body finally releasing some tension it had held for weeks. Rex appeared in the doorway. He hesitated at the threshold, one paw raised. The interior was dark, unfamiliar. His eyes found Grace on the mattress. He crossed the room and lay down beside her. Their muzzles touched. Grace's tail wagged once. Rex's answered. Mark knelt by the fireplace, crumpled newspaper, kindling. A match struck against the box. The flame caught, spread, began to crackle. Orange light spilled across the floor, across the two dogs lying together. He stood, filled the coffee pot, set it on the stove, watched the water through the glass as it started to bubble. When he finally sat down in the chair by the window, mug warming his hands, he realized something had changed. The silence in the cabin, it wasn't empty anymore. The first 3 days blurred together. Mark fell into a rhythm he hadn't known in years. Up before dawn. Feed the dogs. Check on Grace. Let Rex out to explore the fenced yard Tucker had built, watching from the porch as the young dog sniffed every corner, every post, every blade of grass. Rex still flinched at loud sounds. A door slamming. The coffee grinder. A car backfiring somewhere on the distant road. But he stopped running, stopped hiding. He would freeze, ears flat, then slowly relax when nothing bad followed. Grace ate a little more each day. Not much, a few bites of soft food mixed with warm water. Some broth Mark made from chicken bones. The warmth from the fireplace seemed to ease something in her old joints. She slept deeper, her breathing steadied. On the third night, Mark woke in darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. Sweat soaked through his shirt. The nightmare still clung to him, smoke. Screaming. Danny's face twisted in pain. He reached for the lamp. Knocked over the water glass. It shattered on the floor. Movement in the doorway. Rex stood there, watching. His eyes caught the moonlight through the window. 2 pale discs in the dark. Mark's hand trembled as he reached out. Slowly, palm open. The way he'd learned, Rex didn't back away. He walked forward, sniffed Mark's hand, then he lay down beside the bed, his warm body pressed against the wooden frame. Mark's fingers found the fur on Rex's neck. Coarse, real, alive. He didn't sleep again that night, but he lay there in the dark, hand resting on Rex's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of breathing. And somehow, that was enough. Ellie arrived on the 4th day. Her old Chevy rattled up the drive loaded with enough food to feed a small army beef stew in a cast-iron pot, fresh biscuits wrapped in cloth, 3 cans of dog food, and a bag of kibble that must have weighed 20 pounds. "Don't even start," she said when Mark opened his mouth. "You're too skinny. The dogs are too skinny. Everybody's eating today." She pushed past him into the cabin. Rex retreated to Grace's side, watching the stranger with cautious eyes. Ellie set the pot on the stove and turned. Her gaze found the 2 dogs by the fireplace. Grace lifted her head the first time she'd done that for anyone besides Mark or Rex. "Well, would you look at that?" Ellie's voice softened. "The old girl's still fighting." She crouched down slowly, giving Rex time to see her, to read her, and extended her hand toward Grace. The old dog sniffed once, twice, then her tail moved. "You've got good taste, honey," Ellie told Grace. "This one's stubborn as a mule, but he's decent enough." Mark leaned against the doorframe. Something loosened in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. Pastor Harold came the next afternoon. He brought nothing but himself and a thermos of coffee from the diner. They sat on the porch, watching Rex investigate a squirrel that chattered from a low branch. "You still don't come to church," Harold observed. "No, sir." "That's all right." The pastor sipped his coffee. "The Lord doesn't take attendance, never has. He just notices when someone does the right thing." Rex gave up on the squirrel and trotted back to the porch. He sat at Mark's feet, leaning slightly against his leg. "That dog trusts you now," Harold said. "Took 12 days. That's nothing." Harold's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Took me 40 years to trust my wife's cooking. Still not sure about her meatloaf." Mark laughed. The sound surprised him rusty, unfamiliar, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. He couldn't remember the last time. Tucker showed up on day 6 with more lumber and a toolbox, 28 years old, arms ropey with muscle, a scar on his chin he never talked about. "Heard you might need some repairs on the back fence," he said. "Post looked wobbly when I was here last." They worked until sunset, reinforcing posts, stringing new wire. Rex watched from the porch, head tracking their movements back and forth. "Why do you do this?" Mark asked during a water break. "Help out at the shelter. Come out here." Tucker drove another nail before answering. "Because I know what it's like when everyone gives up on you." He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Those dogs at Frank's place, they didn't care where I'd been, what I'd done. They just needed someone to show up. So I show up." By the time Tucker's truck disappeared down the road, the fence stood solid. Rex walked to the new gate, nose pressed to the wire, staring at the open space beyond. Mark unlatched it. Rex bolted. He ran the length of the yard, turned, ran back. His legs stretched long, his body low and fast. For the first time, he looked like what he was meant to be: young, strong, alive. Grace watched from the window, her tail wagged. That night, Mark slept without dreaming. 6 hours straight, the longest stretch since Afghanistan. When he woke, Rex was beside the bed. Grace was still breathing by the fire, but 3 weeks later, everything changed. Grace stopped eating on a Tuesday. Mark set the bowl in front of her, soft food mixed with warm water, the kind Dr. Sarah had recommended. Grace sniffed it once, turned her head away. He tried again at noon. Then, at dinner. The food sat untouched, a skin forming on the surface. By Thursday, she barely drank. A few laps of water, then nothing. Her breathing had changed to shallower. with longer pauses between each rise of her ribs. Rex wouldn't leave her side. He lay pressed against her body, his muzzle resting on her neck, his eyes following Mark's every movement. He knew. Dogs always knew, before people did. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived Friday afternoon, 55 years old, gray streaking through her brown hair, driving a truck that had logged more mountain miles than most people walked in a lifetime. She'd been the only vet within 40 miles for 2 decades. She knelt beside Grace and ran her hands along the old dog's body, checked her gums, listened to her heart with a stethoscope that looked older than Mark, pressed gently on her abdomen. Grace didn't react, didn't lift her head, just lay there, breathing those shallow breaths. Dr. Sarah sat back on her heels. Her face told Mark everything before she spoke. Her kidneys are failing. The blood work I ran last week, it's gotten worse. Much worse. How long? Days. Maybe a week if she's strong. The vet paused. I can make it easier. When the time comes. Or before. If you want to spare her. No. The word came out harder than Mark intended. She goes when she's ready. Not when I decide. Dr. Sarah nodded. She'd heard that answer before, from other people, in other rooms. She understood. Call me if you need anything, day or night. Mark walked her to her truck. When he came back inside, Rex had shifted position. He was lying with his head on Grace's chest now, ear pressed against her ribs, listening to her heartbeat. The whiskey had been in the cabinet for 2 years. Behind the coffee filters and the box of crackers he never ate, out of sight, supposed to be out of mind. Mark stood in front of the open cabinet now, 9 o'clock at night, Grace asleep by the fireplace, Rex beside her. His hand closed around the bottle, the cap twisted off with a crack. The smell hit him first sharp, familiar, dangerous. How many nights had he spent at the bottom of bottles like this one? How many mornings had he woken on the floor, head splitting, mouth tasting like copper and shame? He'd stopped after the 3rd time he woke up with his service pistol in his hand. Couldn't remember picking it up. Couldn't remember what he'd been thinking. That was 2 years ago. He poured 2 fingers into a glass. The liquid caught the lamplight. Amber and warm. Danny died saving him. Sargent died because Danny loved that dog more than his own safety. And now Grace, another creature he couldn't save. Another body he'd watch grow cold and still. The glass touched his lips. The first swallow burned all the way down. He poured another, drank it faster. The heat spread through his chest, numbing the edges. A 3rd pour. His hand shook. Whiskey sloshed over the rim, wet his fingers, dripped onto the floor. Pathetic. The word surfaced from somewhere deep. Look at you. Drinking alone while a dying dog lies 10 feet away. Danny died for this. For you to crawl back into a bottle like a coward. He lifted the glass again. Movement at the edge of his vision. Rex stood in the kitchen doorway. His eyes moved from Mark's face to the bottle to the glass and back again. His ears flattened against his skull. Then he did something Mark had never seen him do anywhere except in front of Grace's cage. He knelt. Front legs folded beneath him, head bowed low, muzzle nearly touching the floor, eyes closed, the same posture, the same desperate prayer. But this time, he wasn't kneeling for Grace. He was kneeling for Mark. The glass slipped from Mark's fingers. It shattered on the linoleum, whiskey and shards spreading across the floor in a dark stain. He stared at the dog, at this creature who had been beaten, burned, starved, used as a living punching bag for monsters, and here he was, kneeling, begging Mark not to destroy himself. And what was Mark doing, standing in his own kitchen, soaking in self-pity, reaching for the same poison that had nearly killed him twice? The shame hit like a fist to the chest. His knees buckled. He grabbed for the counter, missed, and went down hard. His palms slammed into the broken glass, pain flared white-hot. Blood welled from cuts across both hands. He didn't get up. He sat there on the floor, in the whiskey and the blood in the broken glass. And he saw himself clearly for the first time in years. A fraud, a coward. A man who talked about saving broken things while he couldn't even save himself. Rex hadn't moved. Still kneeling, still waiting. Mark crawled toward him. Glass bit into his knees through his jeans. He didn't care. He reached the dog and wrapped his arms around that scarred, trembling body and buried his face in the rough fur. His shoulders shook. No sound came out, just shaking, silent and hard, while Rex held perfectly still beneath him. He cleaned the kitchen at midnight, swept the glass, mopped the whiskey, bandaged his hands with gauze from the kit under the bathroom sink. The cuts stung. Good. He deserved it. The bottle went into the trash. The trash went outside, into the bin by the road, far away, at 3 a.m. Grace's breathing changed. Mark heard it from the chair where he'd been sitting, a longer pause between breaths, a rasp that hadn't been there before. He carried her to the porch, laid her on the blanket where she could feel the night air and see the sky. The stars were out, thick and bright above the pine trees. The air smelled of night and forest and the first hint of autumn. Rex followed. He lay down beside Grace, pressing his body against hers. Mark sat with them. Didn't sleep, didn't want to. The hours passed. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. An owl called from somewhere deep in the trees. Grace's breathing grew slower, softer. The pauses stretched longer. Just before dawn. She opened her eyes. She looked at Rex first. Her tail moved one weak wag, then another. Rex licked her face, gentle and slow. Then she looked at Mark. Her eyes held no fear, no pain. Something else lived there now, something Mark hadn't seen in her before. Peace and gratitude, as if she was saying thank you for giving him a home. Grace closed her eyes. Her chest rose once more. Fell. Did not rise again. Rex stayed pressed against her. He licked her face once more. Twice. Then he laid his head on her chest and went still. The sun broke over the ridge. Golden light spilled across the porch, across the old dog's body, across the young one keeping his final vigil. Mark sat motionless, his bandaged hand resting on Grace's cooling fur. The first bird began to sing, and somewhere beneath the grief that filled his chest, Mark felt something else stirring faint, uncertain. But there, a reason to keep going. Mark dug the grave himself. The spot he chose sat behind the cabin, beneath the old oak that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Morning sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. The shovel bit into red Appalachian earth, hard at first, packed down by years of fallen leaves and winter freezes. His shoulders burned with each thrust. The cuts on his palms from last night reopened, blood seeping through the gauze, staining the wooden handle. He kept digging. Rex sat nearby, watching. His eyes never left the blanket-wrapped shape on the porch. 2 hours. 3. The hole deepened. Mark's shirt soaked through with sweat. His back screamed. Blisters formed over the cuts, swelled, broke. He didn't stop. When the grave was deep enough, he climbed out and walked to the porch. Grace lay still beneath the old wool blanket, her body already stiffening. He lifted her so light, lighter even than yesterday, and carried her to the oak tree. Rex followed. Mark lowered Grace into the earth. The blanket settled around her, soft against the hard clay walls. He stood there looking down, hands hanging at his sides, blood dripping from his fingers onto the dirt. Rex approached the edge. He looked down at Grace for a long moment. Then he bowed his head, not kneeling this time, just bowing, and held the posture while Mark watched. A goodbye, the only kind he knew how to give. Mark filled the grave. Each shovelful of dirt landed with a soft thump. When he finished, he found a flat stone near the tree line and dragged it to the mound. No carving, no words, just a marker. He sat down beside it. Rex lay at his feet. The birds sang, the wind stirred the oak leaves, and the two of them stayed there, keeping company with what remained. Frank's truck rumbled up the drive 3 days later. Mark heard it from the porch where he'd been sitting with cold coffee. Rex pressed against his leg. He didn't get up, just waited. Frank climbed out slowly, his bad knees making him wince. He held something in his hand, a yellowed envelope, edges soft with age. "Been meaning to bring this over." He lowered himself into the other porch chair with a grunt. "Figured now was the time." Mark looked at the envelope. Didn't reach for it. "Dorothy Whitmore gave this to me before she passed. Said to give it to whoever took Grace in." Frank turned the envelope over in his weathered hands. "If anyone ever did, I didn't tell you the whole story before. About Grace, about where she really came from. Tell me now." Frank was quiet for a moment, gathering words that had waited years to be spoken. "Dorothy had a daughter, Emily. Sweet girl, I knew her when she was young. Used to come into town with her mama for groceries every Saturday. She grew up, moved away for a while, then came back when she got sick." He paused. "Cancer, 28 years old." The coffee in Mark's mug had gone cold hours ago. He didn't drink it. "Emily had Grace since she was a pup. Loved that dog more than just about anything, when she knew she wasn't going to make it. She asked her mama to take care of Grace. Keep her safe. Remember her through the dog." Frank handed Mark the envelope. Dorothy kept her promise. 8 years. Then Dorothy passed too. And Grace was alone. Mark opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, a young woman with brown hair and bright eyes, holding a German Shepherd puppy in her arms, the puppy's tongue lolled out. The woman's smile reached all the way to her eyes. He turned it over. On the back, in shaky handwriting that belonged to old hands, were words Grace gave me 8 years to remember Emily. I pray whoever comes next finds something in her too. "Dorothy didn't know about Rex," Frank said quietly. "Didn't know Grace would take in a broken young dog at the shelter and treat him like her own. But I think she would have liked that. Emily, too." Mark stared at the photograph, at Emily's face, at Grace as a puppy, before the years and loss took their toll. 3 generations, 3 lives linked together and passed down like something precious. And now it had come to him, that night. Mark sat on the porch with the photograph in his lap. Stars burned cold and bright above the pines. Rex lay beside him, head resting on his paws. The wooden box was inside, the one he kept in the corner of the bedroom. He hadn't opened it in months. He went in and got it. Back on the porch, he lifted the lid. Danny's dog tags lay coiled on faded velvet. Beside them, Sergeant's collar leather worn soft, the brass nameplate tarnished with age. Mark held the dog tags in his palm. The metal was cold. He could feel the raised letters of Danny's name against his skin. For 3 years, he'd carried this weight, the guilt, the certainty that he should have been the one to die, that Danny's sacrifice had been wasted on someone who spent his nights crawling into bottles. But Danny hadn't saved him so he could drink himself to death, hadn't thrown himself on that IED so Mark could waste whatever years he had left. Danny saved him so he could live, so he could do something with the time he'd been given. Mark walked to the oak tree. The fresh grave was a dark mound in the moonlight, the flat stone pale against the earth. He knelt beside it, Rex following close, and placed the dog tags and the collar on the marker. "Danny!" His voice came out rough, barely a whisper. "I don't know if I deserve to be here, but I'm done wasting it. I promise you that." Rex pressed against his side. Warm, solid, present. Mark looked at the dog, at this creature who had suffered more than any living thing should, and still found it in himself to trust, to love, to kneel before a drowning man and beg him to choose differently. "And you," Mark's hand found Rex's head. "I'm not going anywhere. I promise." Rex's tail moved. Once, twice. They stayed by the grave until the moon set. Then Mark walked back to the cabin, Rex at his heels, and slept without dreaming. In the morning, he would call Frank. There was work to be done. 1 year later, the leaves on the old oak had turned gold and red. The cabin looked different now. A wooden fence circled the yard, the posts weathered to silver gray. A rocking chair sat on the porch, the one Frank found at an estate sale and refused to take money for. Wildflowers grew thick around the flat stone beneath the oak tree, the blooms fading with the season but still holding their color against the coming cold. Rex had changed too. His coat had filled in, thick and glossy, the scars still visible but no longer raw. Muscle lined his frame where bones had once pressed through skin. His eyes carried the memory of what he'd survived. They always would, but the fear had gone out of them. Mark worked at Hollow Creek 3 afternoons a week now, sometimes more. The shelter had survived. Donations trickled in after word spread through Millbrook, enough to keep the lights on and the dogs fed. Tucker handled the morning shifts. Frank still ran things. Though his knees had gotten worse and he spent more time in the office than on his feet, Mark did what he'd learned to do. He sat with the frightened ones, the ones who pressed themselves into corners and trembled at every sound, the ones nobody else wanted. He sat, he waited, he let them come to him in their own time. Frank asked him one afternoon what to call it, what he did with those dogs. "I don't call it anything," Mark said. "I just show up." Ellie had her own way of putting it. That Thompson boy finally found something worth doing. She told her customers over coffee refills. Took him long enough, but he got there. The young couple arrived at the shelter on a Thursday afternoon, late 20s, clean clothes, nervous smiles. Their daughter walked between them, 7 years old. Brown hair pulled into 2 braids, sneakers that blinked with colored lights when she stepped. Mark led them down the center aisle. Rex walked beside him. Not on a leash, just there. The dogs in the cages stirred as they passed. Some barked, some pressed against the bars. Others watched in silence. The little girl stopped in front of a cage near the end of the row. "Daddy, look!" Inside, a small dog huddled in the far corner, mixed breed, tan and white, ribs showing through dull fur. She shook with each breath, eyes fixed on the strangers outside her cage. "I want this one," the girl said. Her father crouched down to look, his brow furrowed. "Sweetheart, this one's pretty scared. Maybe we should look at some of the friendlier—" "But she's the one I want." The mother put a hand on her husband's shoulder. He sighed. Rex moved. Mark watched as the German Shepherd walked to the front of the cage, lowered himself to the concrete, and lay still. His head rested on his paws. His eyes stayed fixed on the small dog inside. The trembling dog stopped shaking. She lifted her head, looked at Rex through the wire mesh. Her nose twitched, One step forward, then another. She crossed half the cage, stopped, sniffed the air where Rex's scent drifted through. Rex didn't move, just waited. The small dog came all the way to the cage door. She pressed her nose against the wire, inches from Rex's muzzle. Her tail moved a tiny, uncertain wag. The little girl tugged her father's sleeve. "See, Daddy, she just needed someone to wait for her." The father looked at his daughter, at Rex, at the small dog who had stopped trembling, at Mark, standing quiet in the aisle with his hands in his pockets. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's take her home." Mark watched them fill out the paperwork at Frank's desk, watched the little girl hold the leash as they walked to their car, watched the small dog look back once at the shelter, then turn forward and follow her new family down the gravel drive. Rex sat beside him, his tail brushed against Mark's leg. Evening settled over the cabin like a held breath. Mark sat in the rocking chair, mug of coffee warming his hands. The old AM radio on the windowsill played something slow and country. The signal crackling when the wind shifted. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on Mark's boot. The last light faded behind the pines. Fireflies began to rise from the grass, their glow pulsing soft and green in the gathering dark. Mark looked toward the oak tree. The wildflowers had closed for the night, but he could see the stone marker in the dimness. Danny's tags and Sergeant's collar still rested there, tarnished now, slowly becoming part of the earth. Rex lifted his head, turned to look the same direction. His ears moved forward, then relaxed. He remembered, too. "Thank you, old girl," Mark said quietly, "for everything." Rex's tail wagged once. He put his head back down on Mark's boot and closed his eyes. The rocking chair creaked softly against the porch boards. The radio played. The fireflies drifted through the yard like scattered stars come down to earth. Two figures on a porch, framed by yellow light from the window behind them. One man, one dog. No words needed between them. No promises left to make. Just this: being here, together. And sometimes, that was enough. If something in this story stayed with you, a heaviness in your chest, a familiar ache you cannot quite name, that is all right. Some things are not meant to be explained. They are only meant to be felt. Many of us have known what it is to carry something alone, to love without being seen, to wait beside someone who could not tell us what they needed, only that they needed us there. Some of us have sat in the quiet after loss and wondered if we did enough. Some of us are still wondering. You do not have to answer that question tonight. You do not have to understand everything to let it rest. The story is finished now. The weight you carried while listening, you are allowed to set it down. Perhaps Rex and Mark found each other because broken things recognize broken things. Perhaps Grace held on just long enough to pass something forward. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was only love. Doing what love has always done, showing up, staying close, asking for nothing in return. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.